All right, so on today's video, we are going to talk about the new educational displays that I have created, and it revolves around Roll Center. Now, let's start with the definition of roll center. It is the instantaneous point which the sprung mass of the vehicle rotates around. And this point is ever changing depending on where our suspension and the suspension ball joints and lines converge and intersect each other to determine what these points are rotating around. Sounds like a lot, but with this display, we are able to visualize it, actually feel it mechanically using this display, which is one of the more interesting parts. Is depending on where the roll center is, you can actually feel that resistance within the components of the display. I have made a MacPherson strut and a double wishbone version. So there's a lot to cover what is included with these kits. So I'm just gonna start by taking this thing apart, explaining the design criteria a little bit, and then showing you how you're gonna be able to use it. And then while you're using this, I would strongly recommend visualizing these images from Google. You can just look at different scenarios and then look at the display and kind of mix and match what that looks like. And then you can start applying it to your own car once you have a good understanding. So let's begin by taking this thing apart. The reason I made this tray kind of a two-piece design is because when you have these converging lines, they actually extend beyond the plate where you need to find the intersection points. I made it come apart so that you can put this on a table and you'll be able to trace lines away from the board. The board is a nice containment, but it does restrict the use of this. So first and foremost, we have full range of travel. This is the MacPherson strut, as you can see I put on the body there. The first thing that you guys are probably looking at would be this grid, and then this sliding grid underneath. The purpose of this is to connect our center of gravity reference point and then our roll center reference point. So these can be placed anywhere on this grid on the chassis or on this sliding grid. And the reason why I have a sliding grid is because the height of the roll center that's going to be determined by these converging lines is going to be pretty varying depending on where you're trying to simulate the chassis. So that has been, I made that super universal for that reason. And then also if you're trying to simulate a vehicle that's turning or that is uneven and it's not symmetrical, you can place the center of gravity in a way that would simulate where it might be if your car was rolling around a corner. So that's the purpose of the multiple lines. A good example of where you would use that is on a circle track car or a dirt track car when you're continuously going around the same corner. So you would likely set up your roll center much differently for one side versus the other. You can still do that with this display. So that is the MacPherson. On the inside, we have different length struts. This is for if you are simulating using this for a truck, for example, you're gonna wanna put in the longer struts. For a lowered car, you're gonna wanna put the shorter ones in. That's just because the range of travel is limited. And don't get mad at me when you turn this and the strut comes out of the wheel. If I put a locking mechanism on this, it just would have limited the travel even further. And because I'm limited to the size of this display, I kind of maxed it out. This is the most you can get out of a MacPherson strut. Trust me, I tried 20 different ways to get more out of it. A couple cool things to point out here. This piece clips into the bottom of the wheel. This is going to be your intersection point reference line. That is actually what's going to be determining the roll center. All these pieces have slots in them, and these slots are designed to accept these blades. Originally, I had made these pointers out of welding wire and didn't really like how that went, but I also didn't really trust the 3D printer. I was wrong. The 3D printed blades are awesome and they work really well, but they essentially slide into these three pieces. And there is actually one that is shorter. The shorter one goes in the top, and that is simply so all of them can stack nicely. I have built in an offset so that they each sit on top of each other. And then from the top view, you're able to see kind of how these lines offer a visual of the converging. Let's get this one out of the way for a second. And you can kind of see through travel how we are able to simulate where our roll center may end up. And then the way we determine the roll center is simply extending this line from the bottom of the tire where the chassis is sitting on the ground and intersecting it with the instantaneous center of the control arm angles. And then where the center of gravity crosses this line, that is where our roll center is. And then the distance between the center of gravity and the roll center is called our roll moment. Design criteria, we want the roll center and roll moment to be as short as possible. And then we want both of those to be as close to the ground as possible. Closer to the ground is minimizing a couple of things, scrub and jacking being one of them. Essentially, scrub and jacking is the amount that your tires are going to be scrubbing against the asphalt when the chassis is rolling. And if I can visualize that for you just quickly, as I'm rolling this chassis, we are able to see that the wheels do have a bit of scrub side to side. Now there are different scenarios where this is worse. You can see as I raise the car, the scrub actually gets a bit worse, where it's trying to push the wheels over. And that's simply because of the amount that the track width and everything has to change, the amount that the chassis is pulling and pushing those control arms in and out. And that is not ideal when it comes to road racing or many types of racing. And then the other thing would be jacking. That's the amount that the roll is actually forcing against or on the spring. And we don't want that as well. We want as much control over the chassis through cornering and everything else as possible. And we want as much control on that center of gravity as possible, keeping the mass of the vehicle, not having too much leverage on the roll center so that we can go around corners and predict the suspension geometry changes, so on and so forth. So that's the MacPherson Strut. Obviously, I have double wishbone here next. I forgot one thing. We have this little pivot key. This isn't an actual term or anything that relates to roll center. It is simply for you to visualize and see how the roll center behaves at different heights. So the pivot key has a square on half and a circle on the other. That is so that it goes through this grid and it rotates on the lower grid. Accidentally, I made this grid slide in and out, but then I realized that when you put the key in, it actually allows you to simulate the roll of the chassis at different heights without actually moving the key. So it's pretty cool. Not gonna take full credit for that, although I did do it. It was an accident. It's kind of like shooting a half-court shot with a basketball. You meant to get it in, but then most of the time you're gonna miss. So same thing. With this key, you're able to rotate the chassis and keep it constrained. This is gonna showcase things like scrub and jacking, and it's gonna allow you to feel the resistance in the display. I'm actually using the key as the method of turning, and then I can lower the key in the chassis, and then I can lower the chassis in relation to the display, and I can kind of rotate this thing and feel all of it. Now, if you had a high roll center, you can place this much higher on the display, and you can definitely get an idea of that scrub that I was talking about. So I'm turning this in a much higher position. You can actually see the amount that those wheels are kicking. If you look at that, it's pretty crazy. Now I'm going to show you the key in a much lower position, but same ride height. Now there's almost no scrubbing. So if you're able to compare that on the video, it's pretty crazy. The one thing to note though is that the key does not represent the instantaneous rotation of the roll center, because the roll center is always changing depending on the converging lines. So the key is not illustrating exactly how this chassis would be behaving, but it is giving you a really good idea of what the chassis is rotating around. So keep that in mind. That is it for this display on the MacPherson, and then I'm going to slide this over. I'm going to talk about the double wishbone now, and then I'm going to put the two displays together and kind of compare best case, worst case scenarios. So that's what you have to look forward to in the end of this video. The double wishbone, very similar behavior. It runs a little bit smoother, or it moves a bit smoother, just because there's not as many friction related components, but the same concept. I have the sliding grid. You can place the center of gravity and the roll center. Couple extra options for control arm placement. We can just squeeze these to unclip them and move them to give us a best case scenario, worst case scenario, or just to simulate your own vehicle to see where you're at. But this one moves quite freely and nice, and some interesting things you can see. The camber gain under compression, what the tires are doing at full droop, how these tires behave under roll. You can really just mess around with these. I find that the most fun and learning that you're going to get from these displays is simply just moving it around, changing the ride heights, moving the control arms, and then seeing for yourself all of the different changes. Same thing applies. We have these. We can simply slide these in place like so. We can line up the bottom of the tire like this, get our third intersection point in place, and we are able to simulate the same thing. What's really interesting between MacPherson strut and double wishbone is that the upper control arm, the line goes through the outer ball joint and the chassis side ball joint on both the upper and the lower. So you see that these lines and these arms move quite a bit, but on a MacPherson strut, you simply draw a 90-degree angle in line with the strut. That line, while you're going through its cycle, this line particularly doesn't actually move much at all. It moves very little just because of how the suspension is compressing. So what you get is a not well-controlled roll center throughout its travel range. We're going to show that when we compare the two. But for example, on the roll center, we have our center of gravity that we're going to clip in place here. And then we have our roll center, which we're going to line up at this ride height, which would be approximately there. And then if we raise the chassis, and then we raise our line, we would raise our roll center a little bit like this. That's kind of close to where it would be. Again, we can move these control arms to change how that would look if I move this outer wheel upwards. I would significantly lower my roll center, and that's it. That's pretty much a clear example of how to use the display and what's included. And then again, on the roll center for double wishbone, we have the same key, and you can illustrate the same things. We're going to get a lot of that wheel movement like I was showing with the MacPherson. You can see how the lower wheels are kicking a lot. The chassis points are moving a lot. This would be jacking and scrub. And then if I lower this point, keep the same ride height, I'm going to get a lot less of that movement. You can see the body is rolling around, the tires are not scrubbing. And that's just something really interesting that you really can't visualize any other way other than using a display like this, which I don't think I've ever seen before, and seeing it, feeling it for yourself. So let's go into some best case, worst case scenarios comparing MacPherson and double wishbone, and then that will conclude this video. This sweater is now available on the website. Looks like this. If you buy this sweater with products, there will be some form of a discount. I have no idea what it is. We're gonna try and work something out. So keep an eye out for that. We have these in stock as well. That does require using these as an actual tool versus just a visual aid. As you're moving these points, it's a lot of little pieces that are together. So I tried to make them clip in and hold their position as best as possible. But at the end of the day, these are 3D printed products, and this is more for your understanding than it is for anything else. So let's start with the worst case scenario and see how that looks on these. Okay, so on this example, we have what I would consider to be the worst case scenario setups for these displays. What we're gonna try and do is match the ride height. So I'm gonna start with line 2. I have this line grid on the base, and I'm gonna set the height bottom of the chassis to line 2 as well. And then let's just try and calculate where the converging lines would be and where the simulated roll center would be in reference to the center of gravity. On the MacPherson strut display, like I was saying, a lot of these you may have to extend way beyond the board, and this would be a very good example of that. We're just going to draw it in the video and follow my fingers off the screen. These lines are almost parallel, and they are converging way over this way. That is going to set up our intersection line from the tire all the way to that point significantly lower, and it's going to put my roll center somewhere around here. So I have simulated a roll center that is below the road, which is terrible. And then I have a large roll moment distance. So this chassis, where it lies, would be really bad roll center resistance. This is not going to handle well. This is what most lowered cars are looking like when you haven't made any corrections to the roll center and you just slammed your car. So this is kind of what you're doing to the car. It's not going to handle well. No amount of sway bars is going to make it better. A lot of people are going to stiffen up the springs, maybe stiffen up the sway bar, but it is just band-aiding the real problem, which is the roll center. So let's look at double wishbone on the same setting. And just if you're wondering, I did match up the camber, KPI, track width, control arm lengths. The lower control arm is actually the exact same from double wishbone to MacPherson. So there is a lot of similarities between these two, just to keep it, just to keep the criteria very consistent. So an equal location for the roll center in its worst case scenario position. The converging lines are definitely intersecting relatively close, still off the board, but we're going to be lining that up approximately there. And that's going to place approximately, again, the roll center somewhere around here. Now this board does slide, so I can kind of perfect it right about there. So we can see that between the two, we do have a approximate difference in roll center. This one is right at the ground, and then this one is below the ground. And we have our center of gravity on the grid at 2 and 3, 2 and 3. But this is just our base point. Let's move the chassis and see what happens. We're gonna move the wishbone and MacPherson up to line 3, kind of redo these intersection points. Once again, these are way off the board. So I'm gonna set up the approximate converging lines there, and I'm gonna set this to the same. Line 3, approximate lines are there. You can see that the roll center still didn't improve much, and the converging lines are off the board. So we have relatively the same thing happening. Now that we've taken a look at the comparison kind of in the worst case scenario for double wishbone and MacPherson, let's look at a scenario that's kind of best case scenario. So I'm gonna bring, I just have another separate board here already set up, and let's bring in these displays and set them up with our lines. Speed this part up, Jack. And what we're gonna do is actually set the ride height to the same as the worst case scenario, and then we're going to do some nice comparisons. Again, I have the center of gravity at the grid 2 and 3. We can already see that we have a significantly better setup here, where our roll center is going to be relatively close to the center of gravity and somewhat close to the ground. So our roll moment has shortened, and everything is above the ground but still close to the ground. So this chassis is going to perform quite nicely going around corners. And you can see that roll center has really nice control, dynamic movement with the chassis. So we're going to be having nice roll resistance without needing to compensate with spring or sway bar. And this setup is going to handle significantly better. You would see a massive reduction in track times. You would see better tire wear. You would see better everything if we're comparing this MacPherson to the last MacPherson, just by correcting that lower control arm angle. That's all we did. Everything else is the exact same. And then the same thing looking at double wishbone. Much better setup, nice converging lines. Let's set it up to the same ride height. Find that intersection point. There, there, there. And our roll center is approximately here. And that is how the double wishbone setup looks. Once again, really nice lines. Easy to do. This could actually be illustrated within the display board, which is cool. So let's see how this suspension cycles through its travel range at this position. Once again, we have good camber gain. So under compression, we're gaining camber. This is great for going around a corner. You can see the intersection point, the instantaneous point, is relatively staying the same. That means our converging lines and control arm angles are all good. And then through our travel range, we're maintaining a nice point that's created, whereas if you have these control arms at weird angles, they sometimes open up and become parallel or not parallel, and that does not offer any roll resistance. I'm sure you can imagine if you have two parallel lines like this, like a box, and they're on pivot points, those arms are simply just going to fall over. Whereas if you have converging lines similar to a triangle, those points are going to resist because you have compression and extension fighting against each other and keeping that chassis, that sprung mass, controlled around corners. This is an example of a really good wishbone setup. So we are able to see how that behaves through its travel range, and we get a really nice visual of that. So those are two examples. Comparing a worst case to a best case scenario, we can kind of get rid of these because visually they're great. But like I said, sometimes just playing with these displays as they are is the best thing. And I can illustrate what I was showing where in this setup, the worst case scenario, we have converging lines at a nice lower point, but that also gives us a really low instantaneous point, and it gives us a very low roll center, a very high roll moment. And this display, as you raise it, these arms actually become parallel and then they open up. So we're actually not getting much resistance at all at this point. And compared to this display, this one is going to handle and behave and do much better than this one in pretty much all formats of racing, drifting, anything else. Now, with that being said, the last thing I need to point out is that roll center is not a 2D dynamic thing that's going on with the chassis. It's actually an axis that runs from the front to the back of the car. Now, a lot of cars that we're drifting and racing are MacPherson front and multi-link rear. Now, we didn't do a multi-link display, we just did a double wishbone, but double wishbone with the converging lines is very similar to how you would measure a multi-link. So let's just assume for a second that this is our rear setup and that we have a MacPherson strut for the front setup. And the way that you would actually be illustrating this, if it was on a car, is the front of the car would be our MacPherson and the rear of the car would be our double wishbone. And then this would actually behave along an axis that runs through the trays this way, rear, front, and that axis may be at different heights in the front or the back. And that center of gravity is also always changing front to back, depending on where that weight transfer is going and everything else. Also depending on the tires, the compound, and a lot of variables. So let's not break down roll center into being something that's super simple to calculate, but break it down into something that's really simple to understand. And using these, you are able to do that. I don't have anything else to cover. The things that you're going to learn from this are going to come from you messing with it, buying it, and using it. Thank you guys for watching this. We're going to be releasing another display probably in a month. I'm thinking one per month is kind of how I want to do it. And these took me about a month to design, and I did want to release both of them at the same time. I didn't want to do one and the other. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys learned something from this. And we do have a bunch of these printed and in stock, so they're going to ship much faster these times. Thank you guys for the support, and we'll see you on the next one.